Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into a massive, frankly terrifying geopolitical what-if drawn straight from our source material, the compounding, escalating effects of China directly intervening in the Iran war. Now, we aren't here to predict the future. We're here to unpack the mechanics of a global shockwave. We're going to map out exactly how a localized conflict could, in a matter of mere hours, completely shatter the international system as we know it.
Picture this. You wake up, you check your phone, and you see breaking news that instantly turns a regional Middle Eastern conflict into an unavoidable planetary crisis. At first, people wouldn't even believe it, right? They think it was a rumor, maybe a bad translation, or just a political bluff. But then, as the source outlines, the evidence would start piling up. We'd see naval movements, air defense alerts, commercial shipping routes suddenly shifting, and these very carefully worded diplomatic statements that carry the weight of an entire continent. The whole world would essentially have to stop in its tracks, stare at the news, and ask, is this still just a war, or are we looking at the dawn of a completely new world order?
The absolute gravity of this is captured perfectly by an observation from the source material. It says this is not just another headline. This is the future moving faster than anybody can control it. You see, this scenario isn't just about moving military pieces around on a map. It's a hard, objective look at a shockwave that threatens the very survival of our global structure. Why? Because China is one of the few nations on Earth with the industrial muscle, the economic leverage, and the diplomatic reach to take a regional clash and turn it into a total collision of global systems.
Let's trace this escalation ladder because it reveals just how incredibly fast things can unravel. China and Iran already share a relationship built heavily on energy and trade. But there is a massive, game-changing difference between Step 1, economic partnership, and Step 4, open military intervention. I mean, trade is one thing, but actively sending weapons, shielding a nation at the UN, or actually stepping in militarily, that completely rewrites the strategic picture. Suddenly, we aren't just dealing with two opposing sides in a local fight, we're looking at a fundamental fracture in the existing international architecture.
And the immediate blast radius? Well, it wouldn't just be political. It would hit the global economy instantly. Markets would absolutely freeze and panic. The Gulf region is literally one of the most critical energy corridors on the planet. Traders would react the very second they saw threats to those shipping lanes. You'd see investors sprinting to safe assets, currencies swinging wildly, supply chains tightening up practically overnight, and shipping insurance premiums just going completely through the roof. It would be absolute chaos across financial corridors.
And here is exactly why this matters directly to you. A war that seems thousands of miles away on a map would suddenly dictate the reality of your daily life. Even folks who have never paid a second of attention to geopolitics would feel this shockwave immediately, and the cost of their groceries, the price of gas at the pump, and the sudden looming uncertainty in their wallets. That is how deeply connected our world actually is. This conflict would literally walk right through the front door of ordinary homes all over the globe.
So as that harsh economic reality sets in, military planners in Washington, Tel Aviv, Riyadh, London, Tokyo, they're all forced to frantically ask some really tough questions. Is China's support just symbolic, or is it kinetic? Are they sharing intelligence? Are they actively deploying ships? Or maybe using cyber operations to defend infrastructure? Because once China steps onto the board, decision makers have to immediately stop asking, how do we win this, and pivot directly to, how do we keep this from becoming completely irreversible?
This scenario completely redefines what intervention even looks like. China doesn't even need to fight in a traditional way to totally change the math of this war. Think about it. Traditional power relies on bombs and soldiers, but modern power, it's all about making sanctions less effective, providing economic leverage, securing supply chains, and giving a strategic partner the ultimate confidence that they are not standing alone. In today's geopolitics, power isn't just military might, it's access. It's the ability to make your opponent seriously doubt their own future.
Now, right alongside this physical maneuvering, a completely chaotic propaganda war erupts. Every single side is desperately trying to shape the narrative before the narrative shapes them. One camp is going to frame the intervention as preserving stability and resisting Western pressure. The other side, they'll frame it as dangerous interference that's actively fueling aggression. Social media feeds would absolutely explode with misinformation, deepfakes, and heavily edited clips. Whoever manages to control the story in those first few frantic hours effectively controls the emotional mood of the entire world. The confusion itself becomes a potent weapon of war.
Let's map out the global reaction, because it creates an immediate geopolitical gridlock. All these different players are suddenly trapped by the escalation. The US is staring down an enormous strategic challenge to the entire global order. Europe is under immense pressure to keep things stable while avoiding further escalation.
Arab states are caught walking a tightrope, trying to balance their fear of the conflict expanding against being sucked into a superpower showdown. Meanwhile, Russia watches for strategic opportunities, India sweats over energy and Asian stability, and the global south begins to fracture. It's a complete diplomatic traffic jam.
Zooming in specifically on the Middle East, this dynamic drastically shifts the balance of confidence. For Israel, their biggest fears becomes the broader internationalization of the conflict. Suddenly, they have to carefully weigh the massive stakes of every single strike, defensive action, or intelligence operation. On the flip side, Iran gains a massive surge of confidence. They feel way less isolated and suddenly have so much more room to maneuver. As the source highlights, wartime alliances don't always require armies. Sometimes just shifting the level of confidence is enough to entirely change a nation's strategy.
Meanwhile, over at the United Nations, we're looking at total diplomatic paralysis. Behind every polished speech and every exchanged veto, there is just deep, boiling frustration. It proves that institutions built to manage peace struggle immensely when actual great power rivalry enters the fray. The UN can condemn, they can negotiate all day long, but fundamentally, they cannot force powerful, heavily armed states to undo the logic of escalation once those states decide their core interests are on the line.
So, with diplomacy failing, military planners start running rapid-fire, worst-case scenarios. Just think about what happens when critical shipping lanes become dangerously crowded with rival warships. If multiple global powers simultaneously ramp up their naval deployments near the world's most vital energy corridors, well, the margin for error drops to absolute zero.
And the panic only accelerates as they consider the invisible threats. What happens if cyber warfare kicks off, targeting civilian ports, communications networks, satellites, or financial systems? The very infrastructure that keeps the modern world humming along could be crippled completely silently. It creates a cascading failure that traditional military deterrence just isn't equipped to stop.
Which leads us to perhaps the most terrifying question of all. What if a simple miscalculation, like a rogue drone strike, a minor naval incident, or an intercepted missile, suddenly puts major world actors on a direct, irreversible collision path? These aren't just Hollywood fantasy questions. As the source material points out, these are the exact split-second incidents that determine whether a crisis stays contained or tips over into a full-blown global catastrophe.
The crucial point to remember here is the fog of war. The gap between an action and how it's interpreted becomes incredibly dangerous. One nation might deploy a fleet of ships strictly as a defensive measure, but their rival? They might interpret that exact same deployment as a hostile provocation. One side sees a cyber defense upgrade as absolutely necessary, the other sees it as preparation for an imminent attack. History's absolute worst disasters often begin right here, not because someone actually wanted a catastrophe, but because they confidently misunderstood their rival's next move.
You know, this entire scenario completely shatters a decades-old assumption. For years, we were all told that economic interdependence would make major wars less likely. But as this text lays out so clearly, globalization absolutely does not prevent war. If major economic superpowers find themselves on opposing sides of a security crisis, trade and conflict just get intertwined. It simply makes the conflict infinitely more complex, highly interconnected, and devastatingly expensive for every single person on Earth.
If this conflict drags on, we're looking at massive second-order effects where the world literally fractures. We would see entirely new parallel sanction systems emerge. New trade blocs and military partnerships would rapidly solidify. Countries would have to desperately reassess who they can actually trust for their technology, their security, and their currency. Ultimately, the unified global system breaks apart into competing spheres of influence, forcing smaller, vulnerable nations to make the painful choice of picking sides in a cold, unpredictable new world order. So ultimately, we have to ask, could diplomacy actually survive after a line like this is crossed? Could major powers truly step back from the edge once they are directly involved? The source notes that, while it's not impossible, it is incredibly difficult. Because once a great power is in, every compromise looks like a strategic loss, and every retreat is viewed as weakness. Leaders risk becoming permanent prisoners of their own escalation, completely unable to reverse course without someone claiming a total victory.
This explainer highlights how shockingly fast a regional conflict can collapse into a global contest of systems. It leaves us staring right at the extreme fragility of the rules we all just assumed kept the world safe. When you look at how quickly alliances, economies, and military posturing can snowball entirely out of control, you are left with one final, deeply unsettling question to take away from all of this. If the future can move faster than anybody can control it, how did we ever let things get this far?